absolute goddesses, including you, David. So inspirational. This is a kind of specific one, starting with Maori, if you will. Your work really expresses liberation implicitly. I know it flashed past on a slide. I wondered if you could talk about explicitly what liberation is for you. And is there any connection between liberation in the work and independent documentary and wrestling with the words?
It's not an easy question. I think I got interested in documentary filmmaking myself. It's why I went to Temple, because I was trying to figure out how to, I'm a history student, like lover, and trying to figure out how to express these histories that I thought were really important, but find them in ways that people would receive them. And so I think that's a lot of us get into the field for that reason. And so I also think that a lot of our ideas about liberation, people actually already talked about 30, 40 years ago. And so one of the things that I've also been, like, Toni Cade Bambara is a major ancestor for me. And I think about her and Gloria Anzaldúa and the folks who were, they had the keys and they talked about them and we've lost them. And so in terms of being guided toward liberation, sometimes it's requiring us to, like, do these dives into the archive. Is documentary filmmaking a path to that? I hope so. But I think what's really challenging is money. You know, it requires so many resources to make a film that is of a quality where people will really get to see it, and then you start to get into, you know, partnership and with many different people, and that may move you from liberation. That's something that we're grappling with as an organization at this moment. I see people grappling with it as they try to make work, and so I don't know how to answer that question, but that's what comes up for me.
Can I jump in? You know, Maori mentioned Haile Gerima and his film Sankofa. If you're not familiar with Haile, he is an Ethiopian filmmaker, went to UCLA in the 70s, was part of the LA Rebellion. Sankofa was sort of a, I guess we could call it his breakthrough film, but Haile is an accomplished, prolific filmmaker who has made, I don't even know how many films, but a lot of people have never heard of him and probably didn't hear about him until Ava DuVernay, you know, lifted him up a couple of years ago. But Haile was my professor at Howard, and I learned a lot about liberation from Haile because he refused to bow to commercial success or compromising himself in order to pursue that, and very much so considers himself a guerrilla filmmaker. And so I and my classmates, we heard Haile rant against the machine just about every day at Howard, and it really got into me, but I have to say that I forgot that legacy that he passed on to us, because once I got into documentary filmmaking, I was striving to make the big films and get the big budgets, and very quickly ran up against the realities of funding that both Sahar and Maori spoke of. And so what I would say about liberation is that I think what I'm learning, at least, is that liberation comes from being authentic and being really clear about why you're doing what you're doing. And if it's for commercial success, then there may be ways that you're going to have to bend yourself to the whims of the industry. And if you don't care necessarily about that, not that, you know, we all want to eat, we want to be able to live and have nice things. But sometimes what's more important, and what I have found in being an emerging director for 8 years, because I can't pull together the funding to tell a story about beauty and Black women and aging now, is that I have to make the film regardless, and that I have to find places and people who resonate with what I'm trying to do. And if I bend, I'm not free. You know, I'm really not. And I know that we all have to make choices. We make determinations and calculations. But for me, I'm just realizing that I'm not really free if I have to compromise everything that I'm about in order to get somebody to see me.
This is interesting. Yeah, this topic of funding also came up with Monique yesterday on one of the panels, right? She talked a lot about working as a bartender while trying to make a documentary about climate change and how it impacts her community. So it's definitely a common thread I'm seeing, and I appreciate you both sharing. Do we have any more questions? Oh, I know we do. We just have to find them.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. My name is Christine, and it's somewhat of a similar setup as the last question. First for Mary, and then we can go to everyone. Along that list, you stated rigor, and I typically understand rigor in the context of like neoliberal academy and capitalism. So I'm really curious as to how you and your organization define rigor, and then if that does lead into the conversation you sneak peeked about nonprofit, changing slightly how nonprofits work. I would love to hear that as well.
Thank you for that question. I think the initial ideas for that come from just old school Blackness, where you have to be twice as good to do anything. And it's something that, while it's seated in the realities of oppression, it's also a really important value. So I'm very interested in, as much as possible, I had a mentor once say to me, you know, are you procrastinating so that you can be like, well, I didn't give it my best, and then if you don't get it, it won't hurt as much? Whereas if you put your all into something, and sort of that's how you show up to the universe. And so I think what we mean by rigor is really showing up fully for the universe, whatever that means. And so it is, you know, yes, excellence, and saying terms like Black excellence and all of that is tied up in respectability and tied up in neoliberalism, to your point, but there's also a way in which I think if we look at people's investment in their craft and their investment in their communities, that it should be at the highest form possible. You know, that sort of you've put, yeah, I mean, to me it should be rigorous. It shouldn't be half-ass. So that's where that's coming from. I'm sorry? Oh. Yeah, that's a whole book. Some of the things that we're trying to do, I've worked in nonprofits for the last 20 years, and I think just very briefly thinking about pay, thinking about work quality of life, you know, we get so involved in the missions of our organizations and serving constituents and serving, you know, whomever, that we don't serve our workers. And so most of our staff are artists or cultural workers in some regard. So for me, they also need to be served. So we have, I think, very generous benefits. We have, you know, I think sort of right-sized salary structures. We have a lot of, you know, Gen Z is forcing us anyway, whether or not we want to be very clear about time and what they're gonna do and what they're not gonna do. But we're really, it's important to do that. As obnoxious as it feels, it's really important to be thinking about rest, right? And really, when I say that we did the festival for those first 9 years, I didn't rest, and that is not okay, you know? So some of that is about that, right? So thinking about healthcare, thinking about wellness, thinking about, I talk to my staff, if they're applying to grad school, they don't have to lie about that. If they're looking at another job, they share that so we can help them prepare. And really trying to make space for people to make work more than anything. That's the piece we're still figuring out, because we're sort of like, can this work? Can we send this to the festival? Is that ethical? Can, you know, there's a joke always with the filmmaker lab, like, can the staff be in the lab? You know, we've created these projects. I think, Sahar, you talked about creating the thing that you needed as a filmmaker yourself, that was just 100% what Black Star is for me, and then you don't benefit from it, you know? So that's something that I think is still on the table, but by and large, just trying to take this ethical, radical care and apply it to ourselves first.
And also I'd say, at CMSI too, I mean, we try to, I think rigor means we think about wellness a lot too, and trying to create inclusive advisory committees, like I spoke about a little bit. And some of that has been, I mean, somebody like me bringing to the work that we do brings a lot of biases and a lot of blind spots. And I think one of the things that we've learned about doing inclusive advisory work is paying people time who contribute to the projects that we do and to the committees that we do, and going slower, so not rushing deadlines that people are you know, many of the people that we work with are filmmakers who are doing multiple things at one time. It's not their full-time job, and they're also serving the work that we do through interviews. They're offering their own experiences, their own, you know, their own value to the work that we do. And so we're also trying to find ways that, and all of that brings rigor to the work that we do, their participation. And so we try to find ways to, and we could do better too, I'm sure, to just try and go slower and trying to award that time with, you know, money, and also not trying to skip forward, because we lose a lot of, you know, important perspectives that way too.
Cool. Anyone else on the panel want to answer that? Or oh, great. All right, let's move on to our next question. Back.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. So impressive to see what you've got, and it's sort of intimidating to see the success of some of this stuff. So just to identify where the question is coming from, so I'm from the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's the first and oldest, largest and oldest school for peace and conflict resolution in the country. And recently we've started what's called the Narrative Transformation Lab, which is in many ways a sister organization of what we have here at CMSI. So what we focus on is formal properties of narrative design, story structure and the like, and how that plays a role in both emphasizing peace or justice as a goal. And what struck me in listening to all of you talking was this tension between the victim framing versus the agency framing, the more uplifting idea versus the energy that comes. I mean, in a way, the story energy comes, as I said yesterday, from the villain, but also from the harm done. And Sahar, you mentioned the idea of abuse, focusing on the abuser and the power as opposed. But it's an interesting tension, I think, in storytelling. If you really want to bring the impact, you've got to show the harm too. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more, especially in this ethic of care, and this idea of like how do we reflect and how are we responsible when we tell stories, because you know, in terms of impact, perhaps the victim framing could be the most powerful. I mean, think of The Handmaid's Tale. That's when I recently wrote a book and emphasized The Handmaid's Tale. It's a downer. You know, that is the way that story ends. It's not a romantic. The Hulu reframe actually turned it more romantic because it was too painful in its original. So I think there's an interesting problem of how do we manage this in a responsible way. It's just what I was thinking about listening to your presentation. So I don't know if anyone had some insights on that.
Well, I'll start and just say that I don't know that it's shying away. I think it's how the story is told and who it's accountable to, and who that story feels, and the filmmaker feels a sense of commitment to, and I think if you're in a room with people who've been harmed, and that harm has been depicted on screen, and you care about that community, it's hard to watch that with that community because you're reharming them. I think Black Star and DOG they're both member organizations, and they both, I think, articulated really clearly what a values-driven, an ethic of care-centered, community building oriented, community rooted oriented work looks like. And I think that is, I'm increasingly convinced that the real change in society begins at the level of relationships and community around you. And if film lands in a space where it can't be engaged and communities are not formed around it to hold the learnings and to help reinforce those learnings, it's diluted. That's going a little bit beyond your question, but I think it's really important to think about how a story lands in a community and what it's doing to that community, not just the one on screen, but beyond it as well. So that's a beginning to response to that question.
And I would add, you know, I'll just share a couple of pieces of feedback that we got from film participants that Dog did when we were working on the framework. And I just want to preface by saying that the participants that we were able to talk to, essentially we were able to talk to because they had good relationships with their directors. So the directors were able to say, hey, you should talk to blah, 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 and blah, 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 right? So clearly there was some sort of good relationship there. And even still, I mean, and I'm talking about participants who were inviting their directors, the directors of the films that they were in, to their weddings, that they still had good, they had ongoing relationships with them where they were talking to them regularly and so forth. And one participant shared that the filmmaking process, in spite of all the good intentions, good relationship, made them feel like a dissected frog. That's a quote. Another participant shared that when they finally saw themselves on screen, that they felt like a cartoon character, right? So if that's happening when directors have good intentions, imagine what's happening when directors are not thinking at all about what Sahar just mentioned, which is relationship. And so there is a tension. You're absolutely right. And we are not saying you're always going to get it right. What we at DOG, at least, are advocating for is that filmmakers take the time to think about how they can mitigate the harm. That does not mean there will not be any harm, right? Because we're human. However, there are steps that we can take, especially if we first think about how would I want to be depicted. There are a lot of documentary filmmakers who say, I would never be in a documentary film. And there's a reason for that, right? So if we can get past the place where we are thinking about ourselves as storytellers, and I get to tell your story, and I get to dictate how that story is told, and I get to figure out where the tension points will be and what I will kind of push for impact, for dramatic effect, then I think that we will start moving towards a place where we are treating participants, because we want them to do the same for us, as respected human beings who are in a collaborative partnership to tell an important story.
Can I just, oh, sorry.
Go. I'm adding personally, this isn't for Black Star, but I'm really interested in us dismantling the villain and hero story paradigm, right? That is, that comes out of many religious traditions. It's how we expect to see story, and it's very popular. But for me, if you're sort of like trying to think in an abolitionist framework, or if you're even trying to, you brought up the word agency, we all have darkness. We're all capable of harm. And I'm very, very concerned about our move to remove people from society because they've committed harm, rather than acknowledging that we're all capable of that as well, or even culpable in other people's actions. I don't know what we're gonna do in terms of making film. I don't think Netflix is interested in that, but I'm very curious, if we were to kind of take that approach, what would that look like if you had a particular story that had, in air quotes, villains? When you look at superheroes, there's always the villain origin story, right? No one sort of shows up evil. And so how do we get to that place is what I'm personally interested in.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say that there's also a lot of evidence that stories of harm and victimhood and trauma are also demoralizing, where in a moment they might be inciting and may be effective because there's a really specific and direct action that you can take in that moment. Over time, a cascade of those kinds of stories can really shut people down. So I would just add that as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Right over here.
So maybe I'm just asking you to tease that out a little bit more, because as I was listening to all of you and Natalie, I really appreciate the discussion about reflection and stopping to think before moving forward with the project. There are films that have come out, and I think of like Whose Streets, and there are a number of others, smaller ones, and obviously all the videos that have been shared on social media. And so I'm wondering more about the audience, participants absolutely, but the audience as well, because we saw 2020 uprisings, people in the streets, and then change didn't happen the way that they wanted it to, and it still hasn't happened. And then people started to like, well, okay, that's not an issue that we're gonna win, so let's go on to something else. Or the people who want to keep working on it, and they're feeling demoralized because they've put their heart and soul in this, and then everybody else is walking away. I don't know if that's something you can even anticipate, the impact on the audience, but I'm just pondering it as you're talking.
I think a number of thoughts come to mind. I know we did a study that I briefly mentioned a couple years ago around the film Always in Season, a documentary about Lennon Lacey and the legacy of slavery and lynchings in the U.S. And it was a film that the filmmaker, Jackie Olive, was really purposeful about how that was going to, how she could use that to help open up conversations in communities and audiences. And one of the things that she had shared was really important with that film, kind of going back to the last question, was to, in kind of breaking down the villain kind of mindset and showing some of the messy details of reality and of history that people don't want to talk about. And I think in my experience, one of the biggest powers that documentary has had that I've had the privilege of seeing and being in a lot of these rooms for has been in just opening up those spaces for conversation, for people to say that what's happening on the screen is also true here in this community, and being able to use that as sort of a way into a bigger conversation that we found is just not happening in a lot of different places, and even in cities that might be fairly progressive, and they've had other events around issues of racial justice. People in a lot of the studies that we did in those same communities said they're still not having these kind of conversations across the aisle with people who look different, who are from different economic backgrounds, and that films, when done well and when done with purpose and intent, and not like just a panel of subject experts that you just kind of listen to, really have that power to create. I think these conversations and partnerships that I don't know that I've seen in other forms of media, and it's still hard to kind of measure that on a big scale. But in that study we were able to at least kind of do it in 12 different communities. Each one had a different political background, a different socioeconomic background, in different census regions, and say that this happened in all of these different places. It wasn't like a one-time magical thing. It's happening. And yeah, I don't know if that totally answers the question, but it makes me think of those kind of things that are important.
Great, we need a mic over here if we can. Oh, we have one over here? Oh,
Hi.
great.
Hi, everyone. My name is May. I'm coming to you from the Riggs Foundation in Seattle. Let me just first say that the exquisite wisdom represented on this panel is just breathtaking. Thank you so much for being here. And my question is around something that Natalie, you were talking about the stages of production. And I am wondering if you could give us insight into how you use and everyone on the panel, how do you use your art in the quest for liberation? What happens after? What's the processing there from your organizations or with partners? How do you use these tools after?
So you're saying after a film is released? Okay, I'll just offer, the part of what the DOG framework tries to encourage is conversations with film participants and thinking about what's going to happen after, like when the film is released, at the beginning of the process. Because really the only way that harm can be mitigated is to think and try and anticipate as much as you can about issues that could derail the process and that could engender distrust, bad feelings, and so forth. So in each phase of the of the framework, which of course is broken down, as you said, by each phase of the production process, we encourage filmmakers to think about conversations that they can have with participants, and not just participants, their production teams, the crews that they hire, in order to try to establish certainly trust, certainly care, but also, it's almost like ongoing and informed consent, because if you continue to have conversations with your participants as you are making a film, and you tell them about, okay, even at the very beginning, when you first talk to them about being in the film, listen, I don't know how long it's gonna take to raise the budget, right? I worked on Byron Hurt's Hazing. He thought that was gonna take 2 or 3 years. It took 10, because we could not raise the funding, and Byron has a body of work, right? So talk to participants about the fact that funding can be really finicky, can be evasive. So this may take longer than 2 or 3 years. Are you okay with that? You need to know that. Check in with them later. Like, how are you feeling about this process? What would you like to see happen differently, right? But also prepare them for release, right? I mentioned that, a participant felt like they were a cartoon character upon seeing themselves on a big screen. How can we prepare participants for the inevitability of that screening at a film festival? What can we embed in not only our practice, but the budget, which is why I talked a lot about gatekeepers. Like, there are things that funders and festivals and distributors are gonna have to help filmmakers with, like line items that allow for that type of care, making sure that participants can get to a film festival, that maybe they can get an honorarium, right? That their time is being acknowledged. So there's a wide spectrum, I think, of possibilities, but I think at the heart of the DOG framework is just asking filmmakers to think about these things. Don't rush into telling a story. Think about and prepare not only yourself and your team and your crews, but your participants, so that when we get to the end, nobody is saying, well, where's my money? And what, like, why do I look like, what in the world? Why have I not seen myself before now, right? Show a rough cut. That's not really acceptable. It's becoming more so. But people have to see themselves. They have to see how you're presenting them in order to even fact check. Like, you've got to show something so that the people whose stories you're telling are able to participate in that process. I hope that helps.
Natalie, sorry to follow up here. What you just said reminds me so much of a beloved queer documentary, Paris is Burning, where a lot of the participants afterward turned to Jenny Livingston and said, where is my money? This is a runaway hit, right? And she was also a white woman entering a queer and trans community that was primarily made up of Black and Latina participants in the ballroom scene. So these things have sort of historically been a part of documentary filmmaking. And even some of our most beloved documentaries don't often face this this level of scrutiny while it's being produced. And then afterward, it's kind of tragic that you've got an amazing piece of work, but the participants don't feel included or reimbursed appropriately, I guess. Yeah. Did anyone else want to touch on that question, or should we move on to the next one? All right, great. Let's find our next question.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here, and forgive me in advance for formulating this question as I'm speaking. But I guess for context to start, I run a small studio that works at the intersection of animation and documentary storytelling, and we do a lot of advocacy work with nonprofits and organizations that are working in these kind of social justice spaces. And I'm curious to hear from this group. I think there's been an acknowledgement that this group of people understands the power and impact of this type of storytelling to tell issues where we want to kind of incite conversation and change. But a lot of the times, I'm having conversations with these individuals, usually on the leadership level, who are looking for that kind of naive, like, what's the engagement? What do the numbers look like? How do we prove that this is worthy of our investment and our time, and it can kind of make that impact that they're trying to achieve? So I'm curious, how do you all think about that conversation, and how do you frame it in a way that's not just, I was just asked by a potential client, like, show me the YouTube numbers for views, and how do you get them to understand that this work is, there's more thoughtfulness and time and care, and that kind of like action impact is not necessarily so clear cut.
I think a way that I want to respond to that is that look to where the attacks are directed at to see where power is. And right now, the media is a battleground for the future of this country. We are tracking, at Color Congress, we're tracking attacks against, Edward Bloom and the Fearless Fund. These are coordinated attacks to shut down any kind of nonprofit or institution that is doing work that is focused on building equity for people of color. You can look to, there was a recent letter from Ted Cruz is trying to shut down public funding for public media. And you can also look to a recent attacks by a group backed by Stephen Miller that is trying to shut down the commercial sector, any kind of DEI work in the commercial sector. This is a coordinated effort to push back any kind of progress that we've made in this country, any kind of racial progress. And I think that that is something we all have to be paying attention to and tracking and get very serious about it. I know that the ecosystem that we serve at Color Congress is extremely vulnerable. They're barely keeping their lights on, as you saw. They're not going to be able to weather any kind of litigation. The legal needs are going to be really strong. The communication needs are going to be really strong. And we have to show up for this ecosystem, because this is the ecosystem that is making sure that pluralism is alive and well in this country, and that stories that support narratives that advance change are present. And they're going to get shut down if we're not paying attention to that and doing something about it. So that's the way that I would start to answer that question.
And I'll just add that at DOG, like, if you're either, like, we're not coercive. If the framework and the work that we do resonates with you, if it aligns with who you are, what you're already doing, trying to do, awesome. But we are not here to persuade or mandate or police anybody. So if somebody wants to see YouTube numbers, cool, have at it. But that's not what we do. That's not where we're coming from, and we're not really trying to win over anyone.
Peace. My name is Jasiri. I'm with One Hood Media. This question is for Maori. I went to my first Black Star last year. I had a great time. So for anybody that wants to go, I would recommend it. What I really like about what you do, you have a good balance, I think, between supporting like Philadelphia and nationally. And so I just, as an organization based in Pittsburgh that does some national stuff, just wanted to know like how you walk that balance of, making sure you're rooted in Philadelphia as well as kind of bringing in national voices. Also, I'm curious, has anybody asked you to do like a Black Star Festival somewhere else? And was that something you're open to? Again, like we've gotten some inquiries about could our model work in another city, which I've been a little bit reluctant to maybe try that in terms of like what that looks like. So I just, as you've been in this space, you do this balance very, very well. Just can you talk a little bit about that balance, and would you consider maybe doing a Black Star somewhere else, or is this for you specifically a Philadelphia piece?
Black Star is in Philadelphia because that's where I was based when we started it, but there have been a few times over the years where support was potentially coming from elsewhere, particularly in terms of a venue. We are not, to me, being supported like we should be by some of the Philadelphia venues and like some of the institutions. And it may not always be in Philadelphia in terms of the festival itself. I'll just say that, and not to be vague, but just I feel like we should go where we're finding the most support. Outside of those institutions, yes, the groundswell of people and filmmakers and artists, and there's so much love and support for the festival by the massive. And we have over the years, I glossed over it, we just did a program in Atlanta last weekend that was like a screening. We did a program at the Portland Art Museum that was a screening and a performance the week before. We're doing something in Dakar at the biennial there in May. So I mean, we're often invited to do projects. Very, very early, funnily enough, we did like a one-day Black Star in Pittsburgh at the Kelly Strayhorn Theater. But that was just sort of before we had even had a sense of what our core was. I'm not interested in replicating the festival. So the festival itself could move. I wouldn't do another edition of it. I think we have so many other programs that it doesn't make sense to do multiple versions of the festival. I think it would take away from the impact of that singular event. The seminar, which is taking place, it actually starts today. It launched online because it started during the beginning of the pandemic, and then we did the first in-person one in Philadelphia. This year, it's in Palo Alto. It might move. I think we're open to moving that around. We really have a global audience. I'd say at the festival, maybe 40% of the audience comes from Philadelphia, and the rest comes from elsewhere. And so people are interested, and they're always asking. And I think the reason we created the Philadelphia Filmmaker Lab is because we were getting some not great feedback around Philadelphia films not being in the festival. And that was not a value, if I'm honest, at the beginning. It has become something that I'm interested in. How can we be a good neighbor as an organization? In those early years, it was everything I could do to just make the festival happen, that I didn't have that space to sit and be more thoughtful. So we created the lab for those of us who were filmmakers. We were like, what has stopped us from making that second or third film? And we've tried to create a lab that supports people in making that in a market where it's not like you can get people who are interested in crewing for low rates because it's their source of income, not a side project, the way it would be in LA or Atlanta or New York. So I hope, is that answering your question? Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask David a question.
Oh, great. I love this. All right, we're flipping the paradigm. The power structures here no longer apply. Please, go ahead. Yeah.
David, I'm super excited about the research that you just talked about this morning, and I was wondering if there's a call to action or if the report is pointing in a particular direction. Can you give us a little peek at that?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Let me think. I mean, so yes, I would say essentially we have 4 original studies that are coming out of this project over this next year. I think this was kind of setting up, and it's been setting up that larger work. So we've tried to do this as kind of a formative research sort of exploration where we're raising some of the big questions that filmmakers have and want to see more funding directed towards. I mean, everything that everybody's been talking about and all your organizations, I think, is what we've learned needs to have more support, more visibility. And then we're hoping with these next 4 studies that we're able to kind of bring some more data to the other point of how do you go beyond the typical sort of number of YouTube views or something like that, to try and bring really hard data and method to showing how documentaries are creating different kinds of impact. And so we have 4 different studies that are looking at this from 4 different ways. So we have one big audience study that's going to be coming out. We have one that's looking at a cultural analysis of how is it starting conversations on Twitter, and it's looking at over 1 million different forms of data, and really just trying to take this impact question that's been kind of circulating for years. And we're lucky enough with the Perspective Fund to have funding to be able to do this and treat it seriously in a rigorous way. And so I think our big hope is that we're able to really bring 4 really good examples of hard data about why this is important and why there should be more resources around this, And I'd say I'm probably going to think of a better answer too soon, but.
Great. Thanks for chiming in, Sahar. We do maybe have a few more audience questions, but I would love to take a moment to ask questions submitted by Katie. She is still watching via Zoom. She desperately wanted to get on Zoom again, but we had to keep her at home with limited movement. She says first, hi. Naturally. Hi to David. And this isn't a question, but to Mary, she says, we are such huge fans of the Black Star Festival and so honored to hear about it firsthand here. So thank you for that. Her two questions are for Sahar and Natalie. Sahar, I'd love to start with you. Katie writes, I'm curious about the finding in the new report that shows even harder economic challenges for BIPOC film organizations that are operated under fiscal sponsorships. Is that because of high overhead required by nonprofit fiscal sponsorships? What else is lurking in that finding?
That's an interesting, good question. The real answer is I don't know, but we can glean. I think one of the things that's been striking to us about this ecosystem is how committed they are to their communities. And so I think what's underneath there is possibly simply that they understand and see how urgent that kind of support is and how necessary it is, and are going to offer that support whether they get paid themselves or not. And so they are looking for ways to be able to make it simpler for them so that they don't have to get bogged down with accounting, they don't have to get bogged down with all kinds of stuff that it takes to run an organization, so that they can really focus, they can leave that to the fiscal sponsor and really focus on offering the support that they want to offer. I think what, Maori, you were saying earlier about what you did for the first 9 years, I don't know that you were fiscally sponsored or not, but that's the kind of spirit and energy that I think that data points to.
We were, just to answer, we were fiscally sponsored for the first 3 years, and then our sponsor dropped us 6 months before the festival. And by some magic, a previous festival I had started, we had applied for a 501c3. I happened to get an Amex bill for that festival, realized that the Amex was still open, and I was like, I wonder if this 501c3 is still open. And then we just applied to, the mission wasn't that different to shift, but yeah, so it was not cute.
I hope that funder is watching. All right, my next question from Katie is for Natalie. Katie's curious, ultimately, what did you decide with the Rutherford story? What were your choices? We've talked a lot about coercion and persuasion and the power dynamics that exist between filmmakers and documentary subjects who, as you said, are often put last. So Katie was curious, did you get in touch with community members to explore that idea and wanting to pursue that project? She really appreciated hearing about this via your intimate experience.
Thank you, Katie, and we miss you. Wish you were here, and hope you feel better soon. So I did reach out to someone who does criminal justice work in Tennessee, and it just we never really connected around the possibility of resources or connecting with community members with whom I could talk and potentially partner and so forth. And realizing, as I said, that it takes time to build relationships, to build trust. I still had, I think McKinley was still at home, had not yet gone to college. And so, and I had a full-time job, as most filmmakers do. And so I was just, I didn't have the bandwidth to really extend myself in the ways that I knew I would want to and need to in order to be true to what I'm trying to embody with the framework.
That's a really interesting response, right? It's taking the moment to, again, reflect and think about what you can practically do. I think we're all very encouraged to go, and do everything and throw everything out and see what sticks. But as Mary mentioned, rest is very important. Taking time to reflect is very important in this work, even if the entire industry surrounding that work is constantly pushing for more. Do we have any more questions from the audience? All right, oh, we've got one back here. What a tentative hand. You can raise it right up there.
Well, because I'm considering if I should make a fool of myself or not. I decided I will.
We're
exactly.
Golden, yeah.
In your steps. So it's actually a question about relationship between the audience and a filmmaker. I'm a filmmaker. My name is Olha Onyshko. I'm Ukrainian American now. And another about villain and victim. I consider myself sometimes the victim of my own filmmaking and the villain, and I'll explain. And also about the ecosystem and about balance, because at the end, all of it is about balance. So in 2014, when the war was about to start, I made this film called Women of Maidan. It was about role and power of women in Ukrainian revolution. And the reason and intent was spontaneous, because when the revolution just was about to happen, I felt that the truth, because at that time we still are talking about hybrid wars right now, what is truth, what is not. I thought that if I follow women, and women always go after protecting their children, I will know the truth. And that's how I went into making this film. The film was in making, and then I saw these women struggling, for example, with saving people from the street, that they were wounded, and they were taking to the private houses because they did not have, they couldn't go to the hospital because they will be murdered. So I started as a filmmaker, but I became somebody who was helping my heroines behind the scene. And as a result, 10 years forward, the film did make an impact, because we showed it at the Congress at the time when the Congress was, deciding if to support and stand with Ukraine or not. Why I'm asking this question? Because it totally ruined my life. As a filmmaker, several of us, we supported 123 families of refugees at that war. We supported, I was personally involved in bringing 17 first wounded here to the United States. We couldn't go public about it. But it totally, went through the bankruptcy, the family fell apart, everything fell apart. So my question to you is, where is that balance? Because at one point, when you're creating that relationship with your, and you're creating your ecosystem and you're trying to help your people, but when the war is not, the world is not ready to hear that voice, and you're giving everything, where is the, and this is maybe even rhetorical, but I would like to hear your point of view. Where do you stop? Because then you, at one point, you cannot make any more films, because you, first of all, you're traumatized. Of course, nobody is treating you as a, as a victim, and you do not even realize that you are traumatized until your life falls apart, right? So I'm my own villain, I'm my own victim, but I'm very proud of what I did, and I would like to ask your advice. Where is that balance? How do you come back? Thank you.
It's a big question. We've got about 8 minutes, though, but I would love to hear your responses, please.
I have no idea how to answer that question, but I will offer that one of the things in our culture, at least in American culture, that I think we feel like we have to constantly be producing. And so people write one book, they feel like they have to write another, and you don't have to make any more films if you don't want to. So I just want to say that. I don't know if you're thinking about that, but that might have been the one film you make, and that's okay, and it's a huge contribution, It's like Lauryn Hill's album, right? We don't need her to make another album. It's okay. And it does sound like you've experienced PTSD, and that's real, and that you hopefully can find some, ways to address that, right? But I don't know how to answer the question. I think only you can answer when you stop, But you have to, it's that adage of you have to put the mask on yourself first. So I think you have to figure out what that line is.
I will add that I think the dog framework goes beyond just encouraging a duty of care towards participants, because one of the things that we heard from filmmakers when we were doing the convenings to develop the framework is filmmakers talked about being burnt out. And I think I really appreciated what Maori, you said about, not using BIPOC, but speaking Black, Brown, and Indigenous. And I appreciate it because it's true. There are different ways that we think about who is a person of color and what that means. And I bring that up because I think filmmakers of color are often the ones, as Sahar has very eloquently explained, we're the ones who are working long hours, no pay, sort of trying to provide this structure that we know is needed, that we need, and there is no support for the structure that we are, ourselves for trying to make that structure. So I would say one of the things that I know there are BIPOC filmmakers, and particularly some who have done really well in the documentary field, they have embedded within their practice a duty of care for themselves, for their teams, for their crews, and dogs, we encourage that as well in the framework. So if there is a way that you can figure out where the beats are, where the pauses are, where the rest is, embed it, make it structural to your practice so that when you're not burning out and then needing rest, but you are anticipating that I'm going to need rest. And I agree with Maori, if you don't have to make another film, or if you make another one, take some time before you do that next one, right? I know that's kind of a privilege to be able to do that, because sometimes the work feels very urgent, and especially in your case. But you gotta put those beats, those pauses in to what you're doing, or else we won't have you, and your work sounds extremely important, and we need these voices that don't often get heard.
And add a line item for therapy for yourself and your participants.
Absolutely. It is wild. I will say I am not a documentary filmmaker, but I've noticed some parallels between comedians and documentary filmmakers. We're all working in full-time jobs that are not necessarily our creative preferences. And when we ask each other advice, we often say, it's fine to stop. You don't have to keep going, which I think is good in any creative practice, right? Just like exploring the paths that follow. But I can't tell you how many stand-up comics have discouraged me from doing more comedy if it's burning me out. So maybe I'll go home and rest after this. It'll be much needed. Before we end this segment and move on to lunch, I do want to add one more comment from Katie that was actually inspired by David's response to Sahar's question about the Documentary Power Research Institute. What was the question about? It was a call to action, right? Great. So Katie wrote, globally, we have to talk and organize really seriously about the extent to which US media companies are fully enforcing authoritarian norms and suppressing human rights work and stories in the US and around the world. We're going to be really in trouble in the next few years as this continues. We need alternative, huge distribution immediately and in the future. I was going to pose a question to you all about that, but again, I feel like that could be its own panel, and we're 5 minutes away from lunch. So let's take a break. We're going to be doing our fishbowl again, so keep your eyes peeled for that, and please come and join us once we do. But we'll be doing lunch from noon to 1:30, so enjoy. And thank you to Immigrant Food for providing it. Thank you again to this incredible panel. We had David, Maori, Natalie, and Sahar. Thank you so much for joining us.